Hi, this is an introduction to logic. I'm Mark Thorsby. This course overviews the basics of categorical, propositional, and predicate logic. Today we're going to be looking at what the standard form, mood, and figure is for categorical syllogisms. Okay, let's do a sort of quick review. Actually, in our last couple lessons here, we were taking a look at what a categorical proposition is. Today we're going to be looking at syllogisms. And just to remind ourselves here, I guess here I can start writing this out to do a sort of quick review. Remind yourselves that there are four types of categorical propositions, and I'll just put CP here for categorical propositions. Remember, there's the A statement, all S or P. There's the E statement, no S or P. The I statement, some S or P. In the O statement, no, some S or not P, right? And of course, we talked about the square of opposition, the contradictories, as well as the horizontal and vertical relations of these, right? We're going to see today that we're not going to spend too much time talking about this, but what's really pertinent for this lesson is to remember what these four types of categorical propositions are. Okay, so let's start off here by talking about what a syllogism is. And let me change my pen here. In fact, I'm going to zoom down here. What is a syllogism? Because there's actually many types of syllogisms. We're, of course, using syllogisms purely in this sort of categorical framework of the framework of categorical logic. In its simple definition, a syllogism is a deductive argument with two premises in a conclusion. So a syllogism, again, is a deductive argument with two premises and one conclusion. And so what you're going to find is that is basically any argument that has two premises and one conclusion can be called a syllogism. Of course, within categorical logic, we're looking at syllogisms in a little bit more of a specific sense. And let me scroll up here and show you. What we're going to call a standard form categorical syllogism must conform to four different criteria. First, all three statements should be standard form categorical propositions, meaning that the two premises and the conclusion of a syllogism here have to either be an A, an E, an I, or an O statement. Okay, that's the first sort of thing to know. Right, that's why we spend so much time looking at categorical propositions. The second criteria is that the two occurrences of each term are identical. Okay, that means that every time a term is used, you're going to see here that a standard form categorical syllogism always has three terms, and each of those three terms is used identically in at least two of the propositions stated. Okay. The third thing here is that each term is used in the same sense throughout the argument, and that's an important criteria, because sometimes we can use a word and have different senses of it. For instance, sort of common one is when people say something like all men are fallible or something like that, right? When I say all men, I don't just mean males, but I mean all human beings, right? So for instance, you can imagine that the sense of the term men means different things depending upon how it gets used. In fact, there's a well-known philosopher who we'll talk about in our extra credit series, The Development of Logic, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he talks about the idea that that language is like playing a game, and there's different language games, and the meaning of our words, or rather the sense of our words, it depends upon the sort of game we're playing, right? So for instance, if I say something like, if I read in a book of poetry that all men are fallible, I know that it's sort of talking in that esoteric universal sense. It means all human beings, right? But if my wife tells me all men are fallible, she probably means all males, not all human beings, right? So we have to pay particular attention to the sense of the terms and make sure that those terms get used consistently throughout, because otherwise this can create fallacies of equivocation and things like this. Okay, the fourth criteria is that the major premise, and I'm going to explain what the major premise is in just a second, but the major premise is always first The minor premise is second, and the conclusion is last. And we'll talk about here what the major and the minor premise is. In simple terms, the major premise is the first premise, and the minor premise is the second premise, but there's a little bit more to it than that, and it has to do with the major term and the minor term. So we're going to talk about that actually right now. Okay, so the terms of a categorical syllogism. I might have just lost my pen. A categorical syllogism, well, it actually, in each of the forms, the types of logic we're looking at, there's a sort of what I call the atom of the logical system, meaning the smallest component of the logical system. For instance, in propositional logic, an entire proposition is that atomic element. Whereas, for instance, in categorical logic, the principle, the smallest element is the term. And of course, we talked about this in the last chapter here. A term is not just the word that's used, but rather the meaning of a series of words, right? So for instance, the subject term can be isn't just one single word, but it is the subject of the sentence itself. Same thing with the predicate term. Okay. Now, in a proposition, we have subjects and predicates. Remember that. So every proposition, here, I'll just write this down. Every proposition has one subject and one predicate. Okay? And that's sort of a review, but you're going to see that's important because that means if a categorical syllogism has three different statements, then that means that there's actually three different propositions. That means there's going to turn out to be three different terms in each syllogism. Okay, so let me sort of see if I can explain this. If we take the terms, there are three types of terms, briefly put. Let me see if I can pull this up a little bit. There's three terms. Okay, there's the major term. There's what's known as the minor term. And then finally, there's the middle term. Now, what's the distinguishing feature of each of these? The major term is the term that ends up as the predicate of the conclusion. Okay? The minor term ends up being the subject of the conclusion. And the middle term is the term that only appears in each premise. Okay, so let me just say this again. So the major term is the premise of the conclusion. The minor term ends up being the subject of the conclusion. And the middle term ends up being the only term that appears in each premise but does not appear in the conclusion. So I have a little thing here. You can see here. This actually comes from the textbook here. But you can see this is what it's going to look like, right? So a standard form syllogism has three things. These two are the premises. Right? And this, of course, is going to be the conclusion. Oh, I just realized they're right here, right? So the major term goes here. This is the predicate and the subject, right? So the predicate is always the major term if it's in the conclusion, and the subject term of the conclusion ends up being the minor term. Now, they will always look like this. Now, let's just sort of put it like this. The predicate term the major term is always going to be located in the major premise, namely the first premise, right? So the predicate of the conclusion always comes in the first premise, and then if that means the subject or the minor term always comes in the minor premise. So we'll just put the S right here. Now, where would the middle term be? The middle term is going to be here. Now, it's important that even though I put the P here and the S here and the M here, that they can be switched around in any which way, so long as the rule is maintained that the predicate or the major term ends up in the major premise and the minor term ends up in the minor premise. The middle term location doesn't matter. Well, it'll ultimately, the order of this stuff does matter in terms of whether or not it's going to be a valid or invalid argument. But just in terms of understanding what the major, the minor term is, that's how we're going to understand it, okay? And of course, the consistency here is notice that each term always occurs twice, right? There's the premises, there's the subjects. I'm sorry, the major terms and the minor terms, and here's the middle term. Okay, and that's essentially how the standard form syllogism always looks. And one of the things you're going to have to do in your homework is you may have to you'll get ordinary language arguments, and you're going to have to put them into standard form, which means you always start with the conclusion. Once you figure out the conclusion, you can then figure out the order of the premises. So let's write that down in our notes here. Always start with the conclusion. Whoops, that was misspelled. Always start with the conclusion when translating into standard form. And it's incredibly important that you stick with standard form and that you demonstrate this. Now, okay, now let's go say one thing here is remember that each one of these statements, because we haven't said what the quantifier is, right? And thus we also don't know what the quality of these statements is. Each one of these can be an E, an I, an O, whatever statement in any different order, right? So let's go back here, and because this is going to concern what we call the mood of a syllogism, okay? Now, because what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be talking about the figure and the mood of a syllogism. Every standard form syllogism has a specific mood. So what is the mood? Okay, the mood corresponds to the letters of the proposition. The letters of the proposition. I'm sorry, the letters of the, yeah. Right. So it corresponds to the letters of the propositions that make up the syllogism. Okay, so let me give you an example syllogism here, and we can sort of talk about how to understand the mood. Now, I'm going to write this, let's say something like this. All monkeys are animals. All monkeys are animals, right? All animals are beasts. Therefore, and you know, all monkeys are beasts, right? So, how do we understand this? Okay, the first what is the mood of this? Well, it's quite simple actually. Is you just have to go through and label what each of these runs. This is an A statement. This is an A statement, and this is an A statement. So what is the mood of this proposition? The mood of this proposition is what we refer to here as a triple A. Okay, it's a triple A statement. Now remember, what this tells us is it tells us the form of this argument, because we really don't care what the actual terms are, right? Just they are. And of course, if we apply our knowledge here now of the major term and the minor term, ask yourself, where is the major term? Well, you can see here, beast is the major term, and monkeys is the minor term. And wait a second, take a look here. Didn't we say that beast, if the major term should always be contained in the major premise, you can see it's not in this case, is it? You can see that if we were to put this, so what this means is, and I hope you saw this, right? That's why I did it this way, is that this is not in standard form. To put it into standard form, we actually have to switch these two propositions, which say all animals are beast, all monkeys are animals, therefore all monkeys are beast. That would be a standard form proposition, because remember, because this is the predicate term of the conclusion, this is the major term. The major term should actually occur in the major premise, and right now it's in the minor premise, which means that I'd have to sort of rewrite these. Now, the reason I sort of wanted to demonstrate that is so, number one, you can see that it's a triple A, and it doesn't matter. The triple A stays the same. because both of these are A's. But if we switched them, it might change the mood. So it's incredibly important that we always put things in standard form first. So I hope that's sort of a learning opportunity or makes sense. Okay. Now, the mood is one thing. Now, so that just corresponds to letters. And if I had said no monkeys or animals, then it would be in E, A, or whatnot. Of course, it's not in standard form, so that's not actually right. But let's go down here. So what is the figure? The figure, because in order to fully identify each possible form of categorical syllogism, you have to figure out what the mood is as well as the figure. So what is the figure? The figure refers to the placement of the middle term. Now remember, the middle term only occurs in the premises, and these are the four possibilities, right? Either the figure is here, and this is known as figure 1, right? You could have the figure both here and here, which is figure 2, right? Where they both end up being taking the sort of predicate place in the proposition, or they may both take the subject place in the proposition of the premises, and that would be figure 3. And figure 4 is this, right? And I sort of remember it. I don't know if this is helpful, but this is how I remember it. I remember with my hands, so I sort of go 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's how I sort of remember it on my own. And that may or may not be helpful for you. And it's basically the same as here in the text. If you take a look at the textbook, Hurley gives you something similar. He shows you this. You can also draw this out, and maybe that'll help you remember the placement of the propositions. I sort of find it's helpful just to remember my hands, okay? But whatever. But ultimately, you're going to have to memorize what each figure is, the 1, 2, 3, 4 figure, okay? So let's give another proposition. Or actually, let's take a look here at a standard form proposition, or a proposition, and I isolate the figure and the mood. Let's start with this one, actually. Okay. Okay, so here is a proposition. I hope you can see that. It's kind of small. The proposition says no painters are sculptors. Some sculptors are artists. Therefore, some artists are not painters. So the first thing to figure out before we try to figure out the mood and the figure of this thing is to figure out whether it's in standard form. And that means we have to begin by looking at the conclusion, right? So the conclusion, first off, some artist is the minor term, and painters is the major term. So let's take a look. Does painters occur in the major premise? No painters or sculptors, that's right, okay. And does the minor term occur in the minor premise? Some sculptors are artists, so it does. So this is in standard form, okay, good. Which means we can now begin our analysis, okay. So maybe it's helpful here if we write out the steps. Whoops. Let's see if I can fix this. Oh, I guess it won't do that. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's try to make it a little bit bigger. Won't let me. Okay. Let me write them over here then. Okay. What are the steps? Right. Number 1, put it in standard form if it's not already. Right. Once it's in standard form, number 2, determine the mood. Right, so what is the mood? Remember, it's the letters corresponding. No painters, so that's an E statement. Some sculptors, that's an I statement. Therefore, the therefore just tells us the conclusion. Some artists are not painters, that's an O statement. So what we have here is a, excuse me, an E-I-O. Okay, that's the mood. So the third step here is to determine the figure. Okay, so let's take a look at the figure here. The figure, it depends. I have to look at the middle term. In this case, the middle term is sculptors. Okay. Now the question is, remember, so which means it looks like this. You had P, M, M, S. That's sort of what it looks like there. So the mood is this. Remember, I had 1, 2, 3, 4 This is figure 4. Okay, that's why I find it helpful to use my hands. So this is an EIO4, okay? Now, that tells us precisely what type of standard form syllogism this is. Now, this is important because now we can ask ourselves, is this valid? And we're going to figure out how to prove validity later. But for now, just in this chapter of section 5.1, we actually have a list of all the standard form propositions that are valid. Okay, so let's go back to that list and take a look here. So that's the figure. We have an EIO for which forms are valid. Now, first off, remember, since we looked at the difference between conditional validity and unconditional validity. Remember, unconditional validity here refers to the Boolean perspective, which is stricter. And basically, all we need to do is look it up, right? And remember, we had an EIO4, EIO1. Let's look here for an EIO4 is on the list, which means that it is valid, unconditionally valid. Okay, now remember there's also conditional validity, and you can also look it up here, right? First, I guess the obvious thing is to start with the figure and then move your way down. Now, because conditional validity refers to the Aristotelian perspective of the existential fallacy, right? That means that in order for these things to be valid, we have to say that S, M, and P actually exist, whatever it is that those things are supposed to be. That means the middle term, the subject term, and the predicate term, okay? And you can see here, this is the list. And notice something real fast, if you will, is that there's actually not a whole lot of valid forms, actually. And in fact, the majority of all syllogistic arguments actually tend up being invalid, okay? So what you're going to have to do for this chapter is really just about you getting used to determining what the figure and the mood are and putting things into standard form and then determining whether or not they're valid by looking them up in the table. You're going to see in our next section, we're going to throw out the table and then we're going to start analyzing it a little bit more succinctly. And that essentially is what this chapter is about. Okay, so let's take a look here at some of the practice problems, just so you can get a sense of what the book is going to ask you to do. Let's see, where is it? Okay, let me scroll down here. Let's take a look at practice problem. And again, all of this is located in your book. You can see here that Hurley provides actually a pretty nice diagram here. There's only 15 unconditionally valid arguments, but then total 24 if you include any sort of validity, right? So you can see here, there's only 24 ways to actually argue logically for something if you're going to use categorical claims. Okay, so let me scroll down here. Let's take a look at the exercises. Exercise 5.1. And of course, you may be using this on Applia, or maybe you're just watching these videos and you're not doing any homework. But I encourage you to do these because unlike other subjects, logic is one of those subjects you only really learn it the more you practice it. So let's take a look here. The following syllogisms are in standard form. So you can see all we have to do here is identify the major, the minor, and the middle terms as well as the mood and figure of each. Then use the two lists of the valid syllogistic forms to determine their validity. Okay? Let's just start with this first one. Usually the first ones are easy. They get harder and harder. This is here, let's do it like this. Oops. Let's do a new one. Here we'll do two arguments here so you can see how to do them. Okay, so let's start with this first one. They're in standard form, so I'm not going to worry about it right now. All neutron stars are things that produce intense gravity. That's an A statement. All neutron stars are extremely dense objects. That is an A statement. Therefore, all extremely dense objects are things that produce intense gravity. That is an A statement. So that's a triple A. Now the question is, what's the figure? And I have to look at the middle term. What's the middle term? Well, let's go back here to the conclusion. Remember, almost in every case, you have to look at the conclusion first. So extremely dense objects, this is the what? I hope I heard you say the minor term. And the major term here is that is things that produce intense gravity. So you can see if we go up here, neutron stars must be the middle term. So let's just put that as our M. Now that means, remember here, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a 2. So this is a AAA 2. Okay, now, is a AAA 2 valid? Well, let's take a look here at our list. A AAA 2, you can see figure 2. No, it's not there. Figure 2, a AAA 2. Nope. A AAA 2 is not one of the valid forms. So you can go back here and be like, invalid. Right? Now, invalid, what does that mean? It means that it's possible that these premises are true, but this conclusion could be false. Okay? Now, it's interesting because if you actually heard this argument, you might not realize that. Okay? So anyway, let's go back here. Let's do the second problem and see if we can do that problem. Hopefully this is helping you to watch me do these, right? Okay. So let's start with the mood. No insects. I don't even have to finish the sentence. Anything that starts with the no is always an E. All dragonflies are insects. That's an A. Therefore, no dragonflies are insects. So that's an E, A, E. Okay. Now, what's the figure? Again, dragonflies and insects that should be killed. This is the major. This is the minor. So the question is, what's not? Insects that eat mosquitoes are insects that should be killed. Dragonflies are insects that eat mosquitoes. So insects that eat mosquitoes, this is the middle term. Okay, and you can see it occurs here. M, M, this is the P, and this is the S. So that means it occurs like 1. Okay, that's a 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a 1. So that's an E, A, E, 1. Okay, is it valid? Let's look up in our handy dandy table. Now you can see here, since I know the figure is a 1, I can just look in the figure category. Whoops. Okay, here's figure 1, and I'm looking for I forgot what I'm looking for already. This is an EAE1. EAE1. It's right here. So that means that, yes, it is valid. Okay? So this is an unconditionally valid argument, okay? So the first one is invalid. The second one was unconditionally valid. Who knows? The third one's probably conditionally valid, right? But at least that gives you a sense of what you're supposed to do in these homework exercises. No, I don't need to say that. Okay. So you can see here, the first sets of exercises are pretty simple. Now, they get a little harder here, because then it says you have to put them into standard form, and then you have to figure out the mood in the figure. Then use the to-do list. So this one just adds, now we have to put them into standard form. So no Democrats or Republicans. So no Republicans are big spenders, since all big spenders are Democrats. Now here, this is going to get harder, but we've got to ask ourselves how to do this problem, right? First off, number 1, figure out what the conclusion is. Okay, once you figure out the conclusion, then you'll know what the major and the minor terms are, and then you can organize the premises into standard form. Once it's in standard form, look for the mood, then the figure, and look it up in the table, and you'll get it. And I won't do that problem for you because I want you to have as much practice with that as possible. Now, what do they ask you to do in section 3? They want you to actually reconstruct the arguments like this using the food. I'm not using the figure and the mood. Okay. And then here's, they want you to construct the following syllogisms, and they just give you they tell you what the form is, and then they give you the terms, and then once you know the terms, you should be able to put them into this figure. Okay? And then answer some true-false questions. Pretty simple, okay? So that's what 5.1 is about. You'll see, of course, next time we're going to be looking at Venn diagrams. And last time we've only looked at Venn diagrams in terms of propositions, but we're going to see that Venn diagrams actually provide us with the way of determining validity without memorizing that table. Because some of you are probably thinking, like, do we have to memorize this table of conditional and unconditionally valid arguments? And the answer is no, you don't have to memorize it. You're welcome to, but I won't, because we're going to see that we can produce our own proofs on the spot using Venn diagrams. And that's what we're going to be looking at in our next lesson, okay? Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Good luck.